Hello, I'm Jim Cornell, and this is Base to Base, the weekly biotech podcast from Air Coastal Media. Yes, welcome again to the Base to Base biotech podcast, and this episode is going out on May the 2nd. Last week, so still in April, among the many press releases were two invites to events, not related to biotech. One was for a Christmas concert, and the other was to book for the Christmas lights in Edinburgh. Also in the emails, there were lots of requests to be on the podcast coming in, which is great. I think we're already into June for guests. If you do have suggestions for who should be on the podcast, please do get in touch at jim@deeptechdigest.com. If you missed last week's episode, please do check it out over at deeptechdigest.com or via your favourite podcast app. Just type in Base to Base and you should find it. As a reminder, the two interviews were with Persica Pharmaceuticals about a new treatment for chronic low back pain, and with Lithuanian company Caszyme, which is working on a new project to develop a new advanced diagnostics solution. Well worth a listen, although I could be biased. This week we're talking about, among other things, the looming Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or DSCSA deadline, with Intelliguard. But first, later this year, MoonLake Immunotherapeutics will be announcing its hotly anticipated Phase 3 results for its Nanobody Sonelokimab for the skin condition hidradenitis suppurativa. I should have just said HS. The company is looking to Sonelokimab to become the first blockbuster nanobody on the market. And to tell us more is Jorge Santos de Silva, founder and CEO of MoonLake Immunotherapeutics. All right, so I wonder if you could maybe first tell me a bit about the history of the company and what led you to forming it.
Absolutely. So Jim, MoonLake is a clinical phase company focused in developing a pretty innovative technology for inflammatory diseases, which I'm sure we will have time to discuss today. The company was formed in 2021. It's a Swiss-based company. In 22, we went public at the NASDAQ. 23, we started reading our own clinical data from very large phase 2 trials, and that led to an additional raise of cash for the company of about $500 million. Then we progressively moved to phase 3. 24 was really a year of starting several phase 3. So as we really start moving our innovative technology close to market. And as we moved into 25, we actually just announced yet another $500 million facility that we've put in place, which I would argue, Jim, at the date of this recording, is probably a fantastic situation to be in, considering where the market is. The company was formed back in 21 on the back of a license agreement that we struck with Merck, that's the German Merck, that gave us access to this technology called the nanobodies, which we believe is the next wave after monoclonal antibodies, which we all know have had phenomenal impact in medicine in the last 20, 25 years. And then very importantly, gave us full rights and access to a drug called Sonelokimab, which is one of these nanobodies. It inhibits IL-17A and IL-17F, and therefore is a very innovative MOA. And as I mentioned, so far, we've treated well over 1,000 patients in clinical trials to fantastic clinical results and safety profiles. So we're extremely excited, Jim. We're a Swiss-based company. We have an office in the UK, in Cambridge, where we have probably our biggest office, focusing mostly on the development. And on the manufacturing side, we have another office in Portugal, mostly focused on corporate functions. And our headquarters is here in Zug.
And what conditions are you tackling?
Jim, in principle, we're very interested in anything that includes an inflammatory process. The type of molecule that we have, which is a very small, very high affinity, very penetrant molecule, is really adequate for inflammation, which obviously is happening in many different organs across different patients. It also, as I mentioned, targets a pretty fundamental pathway we now know in inflammation in IL-17A and F inhibition. Particularly, we decided to focus the company on dermatology and rheumatology. And in each of these two big areas, Jim, we have two diseases that we've already announced and we are already doing clinical work on. On the dermatology side, our phase 3 that we'll read out this year is in a disease called hidradenitis suppurativa. Jim, most people might not have heard of this disease, but it's a disease that affects millions and millions of people across the world. Just to give you an idea, diagnosed and treated patients, obviously not with the ideal medication, but treated with some medication already in the US today is 3 million people. And the same thing happens in Europe. So a very big disease, very devastating for patients, chronic accumulation of lesions, multiple surgeries, lots of pain, isolation, a really dramatic disease that we're very excited to be tackling. The second indication in dermatology, unfortunately, follows a little bit the same pattern. No medication available, very devastating disease. It's called palmoplantar pustulosis. Imagine that you have pustules and your skin falls off on the palm of your hands and feet. You can't walk, you can pick up your phone. It's pretty difficult disease. And that's the one that we have in phase 2, which we will also read this year. On the rheumatology side, we're very excited with the data that we have on psoriatic arthritis. I think the name is pretty clear. You have inflammation of several of your joints accompanied by many other domains being affected, namely your skin. You also have psoriasis on top of it. Again, a very large disease, perhaps a little bit more known, but for which a real therapeutical solution is really missing. And then we have a second indication also in rheumatology called axial spondyloarthritis, just to keep in with the complicated names of these diseases. But all that it means is that mostly the joints on your axial side, so basically along your spine, are affected. Obviously, an extremely debilitating disease as well. So many millions of people affected, huge unmet needs, very big limitations in terms of what medicine is available, if at all. And so we're really excited to come to work every day and make sure that our unique asset can really change the life of these patients.
You mentioned the one with that you're working on in terms of the phase 3. That's the hidradenitis suppurativa. What kind of options are available for people that have that right now? Because it seems like a lot of people have it, but it's not particularly well known.
Yes. No, absolutely. On the derm side, indeed, hidradenitis suppurativa, or HS, let's maybe use HS to make it a little simpler, is indeed the indication that we have in phase 3. On the rheum side, PSA is also in phase 3. But on the HS side, the only drug that was approved until recently was Humira. Obviously a very well-known drug. It has been around since 2016, 2017. But it's a drug that has shown a little bit of promise, but very, very big limitations. Just to give you an idea, only 50% of the patients really have a response. So half of the patients are not even treatable. And of the half that is treated, 10, 11 months into the treatment, it stops working, which is not very helpful if you have a chronic disease that affects you since your teenage years and early 20s until the day that you go, right? So obviously very, very limited. End of 23 brought the approval of the second drug, which is Cosentyx, which is a drug from Novartis. Very welcome that, of course, there's a little bit more option, but the efficacy of the drug is also very limited. Again, you're talking about diseases where you're in constant pain, Jim. You have multiple abscesses across your body, mostly in your genital areas, your buttocks, your armpits. You have nodules across your body, and then you have this unique feature, which is that very deep in your skin, tubes form called tunnels, which accumulate with pus, and the pus just finds its way out of your body. Your body is in bad shape. You have a lot of pain. There's pus coming out of your body. There's odor. There's the needs to constantly clean yourself. And of course, as you can imagine, all of this stuff leads to isolation, surgery, pain, lots and lots of medication. Even sometimes the relationship with your family is difficult because it's not easy to be next to you. And obviously, anything that has to do with normal life relationships is obviously extremely affected. The reason why I'm going through all this detail, Jim, is when I say that the efficacy is not very good or a little bit better, just to impress on you the need that you need to really change this disease. You really need to remove the inflammation. You need to make a huge step for these patients. A little improvement on, I have a few less abscesses or a few more abscesses really doesn't make a difference here. So, and I think the drug that was launched in 23, as I mentioned, gives a little bit of it gives a second option, but doesn't really change much in terms of efficacy. Very recently, end of 24, we had the third drug, which is the only other competitor to us in terms of IL-17A and F inhibition, a drug called bimekizumab or Bimzelx, which had a fantastic launch in another indication called psoriasis. We're starting to see an increase in terms of efficacy, but what we have shown in phase 2, and we are hope to replicate this year in phase 3, is a real step up in terms of not just reducing some of these lesions, but reducing all of these lesions. Just to drop you one number, 1/4, so 1 in every 4 patients in our phase 2 trial after 6 months was in inflammatory remission. They had no abscesses, they had no nodules, and they had no draining tunnels, right? So that's the kind of difference that we're trying to make, not just do marginal improvements.
And so what was your approach to tackling that? How did you figure what would be the best pathway?
Jim, that's really at the core of why we built the company, right? Because we really saw this asset that was sitting with Merck, as I mentioned, the German Merck. And this asset has a few characteristics that we thought were absolutely unique, right? So first of all, only one of 2 drugs that really goes after this very, very, very critical pathway, which is IL-17A and IL-17F. These are 2 inflammatory cytokines that work together in cooperation to drive inflammation. And so if you have a drug that can actually inhibit both, then I think you're on to something in terms of not just reducing a little bit of the inflammation, but the whole inflammatory process. The beautiful thing about our drug, about Sonelokimab, or SLK as we call it, you see that we try to do acronyms to make our lives easier. The other beautiful thing about Sonelokimab is that it's this nanobody. And Jim, what this is a very innovative type of biological product that really retains all the great characteristics that we like about monoclonal antibodies, in which they're quite specific. They have a very high affinity for the target. But these nanobodies allow us to do a lot more. They're much, much smaller. And you can put different domains together. So then instead of just targeting one molecule, you can actually target multiple molecules, right? Which is very difficult to do with a monoclonal antibody. So while we're binding more things, we're smaller, which I think is a really unique feature. And in our case, we bind that IL-17A, as I mentioned, the IL-17F, as I also mentioned, but we also have a third domain that allows us to target our molecule to sites of inflammation, rather than just having it, let me say it, unspecifically across your body. And we do all of this while being a third of the size of a monoclonal antibody. And I think this is really unique, right? Because you're targeting the right mechanism of action. We're really reducing that inflammation as much as we can, but we're also introducing a technology that really allows us to go much deeper into the tissue, target the molecule, and still retain this incredible affinity that biologics have, that, for example, oral drugs will never have. So we were really attracted about this particular asset and this particular technology, and we thought, hey, this is the time that we live our comfortable lives. We were all doing other things before, rather than not sleeping while running a biotech. But we thought, no, we got to do this. This is something that can really innovate for these patients that are really suffering.
Are there any other advantages to using nanobodies?
Absolutely. Because they're small, you also have to dose less in terms of the absolute number of molecules that you actually introduce in the body. The manufacturing of these molecules is a little bit different from monoclonal antibodies. Still a fermentation-based biological product that needs to be injected, as we think is the right way to treat these diseases. But because the manufacturing is a little bit different, the costs are lower. But also you have very cool features like the liquid that you actually produce has very low viscosity, right, compared to other products. And that, for example, allows you to do an injection with a very, very, very thin needle and a very fast injection. You might say, we talk about lesions in people's lives, etc. But this stuff also matters, right? Because if you have a very simple device that you can simply inject, and in our case, our auto-injector takes 3 seconds to inject. It goes really, really fast. The needle is extremely thin because of that low viscosity. All these things help, right? Cost is also lower. So that obviously from a business perspective also helps. There's a lot of very, very cool features, Jim. And I think Sonelokimab, we now know it's a bona fide drug. Let's obviously wait for the approval to confirm that, but I think all indications are there, and I think we're really opening a chapter here in terms of a completely new technology that goes beyond Sonelokimab and probably beyond some of these diseases.
And how often does it need to be given?
Once a month on the maintenance dose. So typically in these diseases, in inflammation, Jim, you typically give a little bit more at the beginning just to reduce the inflammation to a certain baseline, and then you just have to keep it over time. This induction where you take it every other week for our molecule is 5 injections over 8 weeks. Our biggest competitor, bimekizumab, is 18 injections over 16 weeks. We both then go to monthly doses, but again, far less injections, far faster induction. And then even when you're in that monthly maintenance, the injection is just 1 and it's very fast instead of 2 and very long, right? So again, we're really trying to create a solution here for patients that not only increases the clinical response in ways that matter for the patient, but hopefully also helps them deal with the disease on a daily basis, right? Such a horrible disease that you can really aspire to be in inflammatory remission and only think about this for 1 minute a month. That is pretty cool in my book.
Yeah. Does it tackle all inflammation or just inflammation specific to the condition?
It depends on what mechanism of action is happening, either because it's an acute situation like an injury or a chronic autoimmune response like in our case. So these are all different pathways. What it does mean, however, is of course that there are many autoimmune situations where you have IL-17A and F involved. The fact that we quote unquote only go for 4 diseases is simply a limitation of time and money, right? We could go for a lot more diseases, right? But very different between chronic and acute situations of inflammation.
You mentioned some of the other clinical trials that you are working on. I wonder if you could go into a bit more detail about some of those, or especially the ones that are in later phases.
Absolutely. So HS phase 3, we're going to read the primary endpoint as of mid of this year. So very, very momentous for our company. Obviously, a small biotech is dependent on these readouts, especially one like ours that is really focused on one asset only. So that's the phase 3 primary endpoint that reads out this year. And then we will continue reading it and submit the BLA next year in the second half of the year. The PPP trial, the second dermatology trial that I mentioned, the plan was to read it. This is the phase 2 in Q4 of this year. What we've already announced is that in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have a capital markets update, and we're already going to start showing the data because that trial has recruited a lot faster than even we thought. And by the way, Jim, we recruit and do these trials in an extremely high speed, typically double time from what pharma can do. On the Room side, I will say Room is for 2026, or 2026 is the year of Room. We will read the PSA phase 3 primary endpoint in the first half of the year, and we will do the same thing for that second indication, the axial arthritis. We will also read that phase 2 in the first half of 26. So 25 is all about derm, 26 is all about Room and submitting the BLA, and then we hope to be in the market at some point in 27.
You mentioned about the clinical trials, how quickly you're able to achieve that. How were you able to do that?
It's a lot of work. A lot of work, Jim. A lot of work. I think there's a couple of things that I think we do differently. I think we've struck a very good relationship with the CRO. You know that you need contract research organizations to help you run these trials, whether you're a big company or a small company, whether you have more internal people versus external or the other way around. There's always this, and I think we've managed to build that relationship, build that team, and build the interface between our two teams in a very productive way. Then we don't really just offload the trial to this external partner. We run the trial ourselves, and we basically run that CRO. And I think kudos and respect to the CRO that allowed us to work in that fashion, which is very different for them. So I think that's the second factor. Then we exert very, very, very close control. So not only we are running it and see everything from our side, but we also, for example, built a data analytics engine that I don't think anybody has ever built between ourselves and the CRO, where we basically get downloads from every single database of the CRO every day. And we basically immediately know where every site is, every contract is, every supply box is, every patient is. We know everything about everything that is happening on this trial, and we see it on a daily basis. I can see it on my phone, right? So every morning I know exactly who to call when things are not working. But that's a level of control that I don't think other companies observe. And the truth of the matter is that, just to give you an idea, Jim, in HS, we really ran the phase 2 at double the speed that pharma ran it, and in less than half of the time. I'm going to be a bit controversial in saying that I don't even think that we're necessarily smarter than other people. I don't think it's a matter of us having found gold. I think it's just a matter of the industry being extremely inefficient at running things. So we saw that opportunity. For us, every day counts, every dollar counts. We're a small biotech, we're not a big pharma. And we'll be damned if we don't get this thing as quickly as possible to the patients, right?
As far as the patients are concerned, what does success look like for patients with those conditions? Is it management, or is it being free of the condition?
I would almost argue, Jim, that it's somewhere in the middle. I don't think we can really aspire to be free, to be cured. This is diseases where it's not a foreign agent that is attacking your body. It's your own immune system. Very difficult to just remove the insult. Maybe one day there will be genetic alterations or something like that, but these are pretty complicated diseases. If we cannot even fix simple genetic diseases, let alone these very complex diseases where it's not about whether something is not working or working, it's all about balances between different elements. So within these constraints, I think what we can aspire is what I was saying before. Can you have a free life? Can you have a life where, of course, you have the disease, but the disease is under control? You don't have to worry about it all the time. You're back in the world, integrated in your work, in your personal relationships, in your family, in a way that you feel confident and you feel free. Now, if you've accumulated a lot of lesions, if you had a lot of surgeries, obviously not much we can do about the scarring, etc. And so that's why I think it's so important not only to introduce these new medicines, but once we have them in, and once people get familiar and see that it can solve the problem, that we start building the guidelines that allow us to walk backwards, so that when this thing starts in your adolescence, A, it's quickly diagnosed, and B, you start getting treated, so that these lesions don't accumulate, so that you have this irreversible damage. I think that's the type of world that we're building in. Even if you go into social media, etc., and check patients that are talking about our drug and are obviously on our trial and are sharing this with the world, I think you will see some pretty moving commentary. People that all of a sudden can have relationships, or as I've seen written several times, I can love and be loved again, right? And I think if we can reach that, Jim, I mean, that's pretty special.
And you have an anniversary coming up, and it appears that this is a big year for the company. What are your expectations, I guess, and the highlights that you're looking forward to in the next year?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, 25 is big for us. We've talked a lot about HS. That's when we read the primary endpoint of this phase 3. So this is the defining moment in terms of our trajectory. I mean, we've done large phase 2s in psoriasis, in HS, in PSA. We're doing it also now in PPP. We're also doing it in AXPA, all these diseases we talked about. To us, it's pretty clear that it's fair to assume that we have a very good drug in our hands. Now, the question is, how much does it change the lives of these patients? How much does it become, or how large of a business can it actually be? I think that's what we're going to learn this year. So absolutely, now we have the anniversary now in May, very aligned with this podcast. Later in the year, we will be showing this primary endpoint data, and we hope that indeed we replicate what we already saw in phase 2, which would really mean a revolution for these patients. And this year, as I mentioned, we also reading the second dermatology indication that we have. And what we would love to see there is a performance of our drug in the scores that matter for those patients that really is beating what we've seen with other drugs, both in terms of speed, but also in terms of the depth of those responses. So it's really about dermatology. We've just built another 500 million facility, which puts us in a very, very strong position from a cash perspective. But obviously, we will look for opportunities to raise more cash if the market is to our liking. Obviously, these days, the markets are difficult. We have all the optionality, but should the data be great and the opportunity present itself, will obviously 25 might also be a year in which we raise more cash.
Are there any changes that you need to make as you announce results and move to the next phase?
Yeah, obviously now that we're starting to read phase 3 is the time where it's starting to be high noon in terms of building the commercial structure. So what you will see this year is we've started to build our commercial organization. We'll continue building it this year so that in 26 we really start building the US presence. That will be our first market according to our plans. That's really the next big build up in terms of us as an organization.
Well, a fantastic development, and it will be very interesting to keep an eye out for those phase 3 results later in the year. I know tackling every condition and disease is really important, but some diseases do get more attention than others. So it's great that MoonLake and companies like them are tackling a condition with a high unmet need. I completely avoided having to say hidradenitis suppurativa again there, although maybe I didn't. Next, we're talking about, among other things, the looming Drug Supply Chain Security Act deadline and what it means for biotech and biopharma companies. One company that can help with the process is Intelliguard, a healthcare technology company dedicated to helping more than 700 US hospitals and health systems focus on patient-centered care. Our guest is Tim Tinnel, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Intelliguard. All right, hi Tim, and thanks for joining us on the podcast this week. I wonder if first you could tell us a little bit about Intelliguard.
Oh, fantastic. So Intelliguard is a medtech company with kind of a unique, if not us who, mentality. And our mission or just cause is to create a world where an intelligent information ecosystem empowers healthcare providers to focus on patient-centered care. And that mission has always been to revolutionize healthcare through innovative digital and hardware solutions, whether it's leveraging data and information to improve patient safety, enhancing patient care through passive operating room automation, or streaming data to empower clinicians. We've really built our business by actively partnering with our hospital clients and tackling some of their biggest medical management and supply chain challenges.
What's the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which is a bit of a mouthful?
It's a mouthful, and the answer to that's an even bigger mouthful as we go through this. It helps to get a little bit of a kind of a background story on it and its kind of corollaries within retail. So if you look at the retail industry, you get out of the healthcare, look at the retail. There was a recent U.S. government accountability office in the U.S. that suggested that as many as 2 out of every 5 brand name products available online and through third-party retailers are counterfeited. Other studies suggest that over 25% of consumers have unknowingly purchased counterfeit products online. And in healthcare, the WHO organization went through, and it's an epidemic globally, where it's estimated between 10 and 30% of medicines sold worldwide, especially in low and middle income countries, are counterfeit. In contrast, in high income countries like the United States, it is significantly lower, estimated to be less than 1%. But as those drug costs continue to rise and availability and shortages will continue to rise, it's projected that number is also going to rise. And you think 1% is a low number compared to 10 to 30, but that's still 1 out of every 100 drugs, to 1 out of every 100 drugs potentially could have been altered in some way or would end up being counterfeited. So the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was enabled in 2013 in a response to a severe outbreak of fungal meningitis. There was an issue where that event caused 64 deaths and kind of highlighted that need for an enhanced security and traceability within the drug supply chain, and it birthed the idea of the DSCSA. And so in that creation to enhance the security of the pharmaceutical supply chain and protect patients from potentially dangerous drugs, as I mentioned, counterfeit, stolen, contaminated medications, it really establishes the framework for both electronic tracking and tracing of most prescription drugs. enabling a faster identification, removal of those illegitimate products from the market, and to prevent those potentially dangerous drugs from reaching patients and ensuring that integrity of the pharmaceutical supply chain.
And what are the new requirements that are coming up? And are those good for patients and for companies, or are they bad, or a bit of both?
Like all regulatory, all rulings, you get a mix of that, right? So the DSCSA aims, its goal is to create that more secure and transparent pharmaceutical supply chain. And it requires electronic tracing of prescription drugs at a package level, so an individual package level. And that means that every package of a prescription drug has to have a unique identifier. So it's uniquely identifying that individual package. It includes a serial number, here in the States, a national drug code or an NDC to recognize what that drug actually is, and other information that allows it easier to track it as it's moving through the supply chain. So you think of the requirements around it, that product serialization, transaction information that follows that package through the supply chain, interoperable verification so that if as you pass it through the supply chain, you're confident of that handoff or the veracity of that information that's being passed along. Any of the ancillary returns, all the things that go around that supply chain and all those transactions, all have identifiable, traceable, and tracking information that's able to be reported on electronically through all the trading partners, all the way through that supply chain experience. So the idea behind it is to enhance the patient safety. So what's in it for the patients is that you're preventing fake or counterfeit drugs from entering the supply chain. And it's helping to ensure that those patients are receiving authentic and safe medications, which is really its goal. And with that, you're improving also the drug traceability, which helps the manufacturers understand how their products are moving through, which was kind of a blind spot for them. But it does come at a bit of a cost. You end up with all the setup costs that are included in increasing those compliance costs and implementing and maintaining those DSCSA compliance systems, operational complexity, and now you're having to actually be responsible for the tracing and reporting on where they are within that supply chain and having the histories. And that creates a data burden that wasn't there before and a change in manufacturing processes. But at the end of the day, it does allow a much safer patient experience, and it gives confidence to the market that they're receiving authentic drugs, which I think is both beneficial for the patients, the prescribers, the distributors, as well as the manufacturers.
And do those requirements for companies evolve over time or change any?
Well, anyone who tracks the DSCSA compliance will say that they've seen, it's been a stutter start. We've had many starts and stops on implementation, which is actually a good thing. There's insight into, as we begin this, questions arise. People want to understand what's happening within the edge cases that make up. Most of these are situations that the supply chain itself is fairly easy to understand, but the complexity comes into play with how do we actually enact and follow regulatory guidance and follow that. So the evolution of it is that it applies to different groups at different times. So there was initially, again, this was introduced in 2013. Obviously, there's quite a bit of delay in enforcement. And the latest enforcement issued certain exemptions to partners up until October of last year. Now those are in force in the extended enforcement of the DSCSA regulations. And then there are additional regs coming up on when do manufacturers and repackagers, which I think is at the end of May, distributors and wholesale distributors have until August 27th, dispensers, and that's mainly the pharmacies, the dispensing locations with 26 or more employees have another deadline. I think it's again November of 2025. And then smaller dispensers were given an exemption because it's harder for them typically to be able to get up to those requirements. They don't have the resources. So they've given them almost another year, I think it's November of 2026, to be able to reach those compliance deadlines. So that stair-step approach, I think, has been helpful in allowing these organizations to get to and maintain compliance.
To say that there have been a lot of changes in the US would be a bit of an understatement recently. Right. So with the new administration, is there a possibility that all of this may change again?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. And what we see with the DSCSA specifically, and a lot of folks are couching it around this idea of the regulatory freeze. I think that was done in January of this year. And that freeze was more around the new rules and enforcement of pending regulations. And since the compliance deadlines with DSCSA were already established, despite the political landscape's recent shifts, these deadlines remain firmly in place. So the regulatory freeze that was introduced has generated discussions for sure, but it does not alter these legally mandated timelines, and businesses still must continue to prepare and ensure compliance.
So what would you say are the main challenges with implementation at each step, whether it's from the drug companies or hospitals, administration?
I think anytime you introduce transformative regulations into an established industry, it's going to create some disruption. The upside is you're spawning new technologies to solve new problems, but you're also creating edge cases that maybe weren't known when these regulations were being put in place that are only tested through enforcement of the policies. So I would say that the main challenges with the DSCSA from an implementation perspective across these various organizations will include the industry readiness, which created some of these delays in enforcement, completeness and accurate data being maintained and the systems in place to be able to maintain them, and any evolution of the standards over time as these cases are tested through policy or enforcement, as well as that transitory inventory and data, what's in flight, how do you handle those things that are in flight right now that don't really fall within the ability to be able to uniquely serialize something that's already in the supply chain. So there's several challenges in there, and specifically manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies face those challenges in collaboration, exchanging data, ensuring system interoperability, and the government too faces challenges in enforcing and maintaining enough flexibility to adapt those DSCSA requirements as they see these edge cases come up. And they've shown, I think, good judgment compared to other regulatory events that I've seen enacted. They've paused when it's been right to pause, metered it out, I think, appropriately to these organizations that it would be more of a challenge to be able to be compliant.
What do you think down the road this means ultimately for drug companies?
I think that once you solve the initial hurdles of the implementations, we get to a steady state. I think that the DSCSA requires the drug companies to implement all that electronic tracing, tracking, verification systems for prescription drugs throughout the supply chain. And it'll ensure that I think all the parties involved in the distribution of these prescription drugs have access to a comprehensive record of transactions and can verify the legitimacy of the product at each stage. So it's not good for the manufacturers. It's not good for anyone to have counterfeit medications being introduced into the supply chain. So I think it gives confidence to the buyers. It gives confidence to the distributors, gives confidence at the end patients that the drugs that are actually getting to them to be dispensed and administered are actually that very vial that was created at that manufacturing site. So I think that once it settles down, it'll certainly remove those potentially harmful drugs from entering the supply chain. And I think it'll benefit everybody reputationally and all the way around.
Are there any sort of loopholes or any way that could be circumvented? And I'm thinking of drugs getting in from different countries, different sources. Are there any fears of that?
There are always challenges when you're working with a global drug supply system, and these are mainly aimed at solving the question of drugs that are within the U.S. supply chain. I think that there are enough other regulatory compliance guidelines on medications that are being manufactured in other countries or anywhere else within that global supply chain that ensures that at the point of U.S. manufacturer distribution, that they can authenticate those drugs as being drugs. They test, all those things are in place. So I think that this wasn't aimed to solve maybe the global distribution as much as let's control what we know we have control over and then tackle, and there are other regulations that fit within that global marketplace to ensure that what we have coming into the country, and every country has these same type of regs, they're same organizations that are testing these drugs to ensure their authenticity.
And taking, I guess, one step back from that pathway of the drugs to the patients, do you think that there's going to be any impact on research?
I think that they'll be positive for the most part. The primary impact to pharmaceutical research is that it's promoting a more secure and transparent drug supply chain, which in turn should enhance the safety and reliability of the drugs they're using in research. So through all the measures that are activated, like the electronic tracking, unique product identifiers, requirement for all trading partners to maintain, a secure and interconnected network for distribution, it will, I think, ensure that there would be no introduction of any drugs that would be tampered with, or any of that would improve that research, right? The accuracy of the research. But I think there may be a few problems, not really problems as much as challenges for research institutions, particularly those that rely on international collaboration or have complex supply chains. The need for interoperable systems and electronic data exchange may require investments in technology and infrastructure that normally they wouldn't have within their research budgets. But I think that the benefits far outweigh any costs that it may add to that research.
What are the ways that you're able to help in these processes?
It's a unique positioning, really. Intelliguard has been at the forefront of standardized medication management for decades. Our RFID hardware and digital technologies were designed from the ground up to future-proof full transparency and visibility into our hospital clients and the health systems and distribution partners that we have. We work closely and have worked closely with many of these pharmaceutical companies to ensure that serialization, the ongoing transactions, interoperability, reporting capabilities to DSCSA are transparent for our partners. And we took the DSCSA actually one step further into the hospitals. So if you're a dispenser, you're a pharmacy within a hospital, those drugs go past the pharmacy and into procedural areas to ensure that the patients are receiving that same confidence that the medication that wasn't just delivered to the pharmacy was authentic and not tampered with, and all the things that go along with the DSCSA. But we're also giving them that same identifier throughout the hospital's inventory systems. And it takes that individual vial supply chain from manufacturer to dispense and usage. So what would normally stop with DSCSA at the hospital door, we actually further that out to the administration of the patient and ensure through serialization of that item that it made it not only to the hospital dock and into the pharmacy, but it made it all the way through the distribution channels in the hospital to get to that patient. And I think that gives confidence and creates the best possible outcomes for our most valued customer, our clients' patients.
We've been seeing a lot more interest and a lot more questions since all of this started happening.
I've had many questions come up on the DSCSA. I've talked with many groups. We've had several of these similar conversations with people about the impact. And most everything that I'm hearing from everyone, other than that initial lift of getting the processes in place, is how do we take it to that next step? Which right now, if you truly want inventory transparency, you have to go beyond the GS1-2D barcodes that are on that medication. And we see an evolution into RFID enablement of them so that you can actually validate larger quantities of items more quickly. And it takes the burden down within those hospital systems and the supply chain. So A lot of what I'm hearing from folks are, how can we enable your RFID platforms to be able to simplify once we have medications entering that last distribution? How can we add it at the manufacturer? How can we add it at the distributor? How can we add it at the point entering the pharmacy to make our demands on each of those steps a little easier to be able to manage? Right now, with barcoding, you're scanning each of these either items or pallets or cases. With RFID, you're just scanning them as they're going through naturally within a supply network. So we've seen an uptick in interest in how to make this an easier process for each of those partners, trading partners in the supply chain.
Is there anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover?
I think it was probably covered most everything that I would want to get across to folks, other than it's not a scary process. It's a very healthy process to go through. As long as you're remembering that we're all in this business because there's a patient at the very end of the process. And all of the things that we do are always metered by that responsibility. And I think that you'll see a lot of organizations who will see that there's more benefits outside of just the track and trace capabilities around understanding exactly where within the supply chain all of the medications are, more visibility for the manufacturers and their production capabilities, more visibility into the usage when you're using systems that are enabled to be able to understand where that particular vial is within the either inventory in the hospital or the supply chain in general. And you'll be able to get tighter on the controls of that inventory and hopefully be able to prevent or at least react better to shortages and other issues of these hospital partners of our space.
So now you know all about the DSCSA, and it's very useful for companies having to navigate some of those complexities and rules that companies like Intelliguard are there to assist. A really informative chat there. I already have 4 interviews to choose from for next week, so more difficult decisions to make. If you have questions or comments or suggestions for guests, please do get in touch, and you can do so at jim@deeptechdigest.com. So until next week, wherever in the world you are, I hope you have a great week. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next week for another Base to Base Biotech podcast. The Base to Base Biotech podcast is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.